Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. And once again, we get to sit and relax and hear a story. I'm excited about our guest. We almost had to shut up here a moment ago because I'm anxious to hear about his story. Dr. Lawrence Feingold, former agnostic. He's the Associate Professor of Philosophy and Theology at Kenrick Glennon Seminary. Author of his newest book is The Eucharist, Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion. We were talking a bit about artwork, and maybe we'll get to it. I don't want to get ahead. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Yep.
It's good to have you here, and I'm anxious to hear your story. A lot of it has to do with beauty and art, which is always what we talk about here. But let me get out of the way. Let me shut up, and let me ask you to start from the beginning, and let's hear your story.
Okay, the beginning is I was raised as an atheist, basically. So my dad was Jewish, but when he was 13 in bar mitzvah, that was it for him.
Yeah. Which always amazes me when those of us that don't have a lot of Jewish background at all are unfamiliar, that there are whole groups of Jews and their families that they're Jews, but even the idea of having a religion as a part of their life is really not important at all. Membership in the people is very important. Yeah.
But so he kind of went, so he was a physicist, my dad, and it was his religion, at least through most of his, till towards the end, was that of science. Yeah. And so that's how I was brought up.
Finding the unified theory.
Something like that. But an interesting thing was, in science, he would use as one of his principles the theory that's simple, elegant, and beautiful. Yeah. That's what will be the true one. Right? So there was that sense of the awe and mystery and beauty of the universe. But that's about so that was my dad's side. And my mom's side, she was a full and away Protestant Congregationalist. But so my religious experience was a handful of times at a Unitarian church, and Sunday school at the Unitarian Church on astronomy. So that was more or less.
So for them, was it? Were they teaching you atheism, or would you say, "Well, leave it up to him"?
No indoctrination. It was just
okay.
Yeah, and so the first step towards faith came in college. So I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and I was undecided what to study. But I was.
No one in all those early years tried to bring you into faith of any sort that you can think of.
No, nothing. No, I mean, I knew I had this vague awareness that some of my friends were Catholics, but nothing. And so the first experience was at college, freshman year. I took an art history class. And so this class ended up really changing my life, planting seeds that 10 years later brought us into the church. And so it was a class on art history. And I remember the first, it's the only thing I remember from, I'm slightly exaggerating, but it's one of the few classes I remember from undergraduate. Was so the first class, the professor was I think he was a Presbyterian, so he was a very much a believing Christian, and he put these two slides on the board. Woman Number 4 by de Kooning, an abstract expressionist, kind of somewhat degrading and chaotic, and a Rembrandt portrait of ytsync-en. So it was a Rembrandt, a secular portrait, but showing the dignity of the human person. I mean, it was, and so the question was, if you were on your deathbed, which of these two paintings, would you want to have over your bed to contemplate? And so there are 200 freshmen in this class, and so I was making things like Woman Number 4 at that time. I was interested in abstract expressionist, and I was kind of indoctrinated in modern art. But I knew on my deathbed I would want to have the Rembrandt. And the only thing I would have said was there's an image of human dignity there. And so throughout the course, he kept on making comparisons. And his thesis was that art isn't just simply about giving visual pleasure or aesthetic pleasure or expressing the times. It's expressing a worldview. And I think he got this from Francis Schaeffer and that idea of the art expressing a worldview. And so the whole course was kind of modeled on that idea. And so we looked at different worldviews expressed in the arts. And so Greek Polyclitus, or the Roman, the Parthenon, the Roman triumphal arch, and showing how the form is showing a vision that's much more global, really about God, man, society.
Would it have, that's fascinating, because if you think of music, there is certain kinds of music that you hear it, well, I know that's Spanish. There's certain kinds of music, well, I know that's British. I know that's French or German.
Right.
And I'm wondering, like you said, in a time, an artist, artwork in a time, is it because there were lots of people doing art, but people of this culture gravitated towards this because it was an expression of their culture?
Right. So it's part of, I think art is very much a social phenomenon. You can't do art as an island. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a minute. And so art ends up, the reason why it expresses this worldview is because the artist shares a worldview of his society. And so even if a particular artist like Caravaggio might not be an exemplary Catholic, his works can show a very, very deep insight into the Catholic worldview.
So the combination of the artist expressing what he has experienced in culture, but then the people that buy it or like it or doing it are also coming out of their culture. So that's why these guys survive and not Fred over here that did that crazy thing. And it didn't fit the time of that culture, even though that was him.
Right.
But the people didn't like it, so it kind of fell by the wayside. And
all right, that could be part of that. So, but then the professor had another point. So he also was very anti-Hegelian. So there's this idea of Weltanschauung worldview is a Hegelian kind of idea, right? That the artist is expressing the worldview of a culture, and the idea would be to be on the avant-garde of that.
Pushing
that worldview forward. And so his idea was, no, the mission of the artist is to express the true worldview, and therefore not simply to be a mirror of his times, that would be slavish, but to be a prophetic witness of the truth of man, God, and
so a thread then that would be going through all these cultures would be what you're talking about.
Exactly. And so he taught us to compare these different expressions of worldview for seeking the true one. And the underlying idea is that beauty and truth go together. And therefore, this one that has this profound beauty, that's got to show us something about the truth. All right, so this is the way of beauty. In other words, the reason why the way of beauty can lead to the truth of the faith is because truth and beauty are...
Which is interesting. It kind of parallels your dad's idea of the simple, the beauty. So in other words, from a totally scientific view with all the different theories and out there's this thread of the simple, the beauty, the clear, E equals MC squared. It's just a perfect little idea that it just makes sense and beauty, and it just,
right, there's a beauty written into creation. That's the idea. And therefore, in the arts, that can be a way to lead us to the... all right, so that was kind of the first. So through this course, I fell in love with Christian art because I found in Christian art a depth. And so it was interesting. He kind of laid out, say, a Greek Apollo, a Roman portrait of. But there's something in the Christian art that, even though it's obviously drawing, Renaissance art is drawing on the classical, but there's something different. And that something different comes from the fact that, say in Greek art, it's the Apollo, in other words, the ideal, the kind of the Platonic form of man. But in Christian art, there's this idea that you and I have this, right, made in the image of God, redeemed by all the blood of Christ. And so individuality, so with Rembrandt and portrait, that has been elevated, right? That individuality is itself something so loved by God. All right, so I fell in love with that
I was going to say
idea.
the average person doesn't see all that in the picture, but there's something inside of it that says, I like that.
Yeah, that's it, exactly.
There's something there that connects with
Right. Now, of course, he told us if we wrote, I like that, we would fail the course. So we had to give the reasons why. But yeah, that's the first reaction. All right, so this led us, so I loved that course. And a couple of years later, my wife and I, we were not yet married, we're in Germany for junior year abroad, and the University of Tübingen in Germany. And so we had a long break between semesters, about 6 weeks, where we got an interrail pass and traveled through Europe looking at artworks. And again, my my then future wife, Marcia, was also from a Jewish family, and she had lost her faith, and she was likewise a Jewish athist. So
Our guest is Dr. Lawrence Feingold. So the two of you,
so we
faith
went,
is not a part of your discussion,
not at all.
not a part of any, when Sunday or Saturday come along, just
right,
nothing.
nothing.
Okay, gotcha.
But we went through Europe, going to church after church. So we went through, saw the great Gothic cathedral. So one day we were in, Christmas Day of that year, we were in Chartres Cathedral.
Oh, wow.
So in the early afternoon, it was lunchtime, so the cathedral was totally empty, except, everybody's at Christmas lunch, except for monks chanting Gregorian chant in the sanctuary. And it was heaven on earth. So that was, so looking in hindsight, we could see all these things where God was poking us and attracting. So that was a beautiful, and then Italy, we fell in love with, Renaissance art there and so forth. And so we were constantly in church. We would leave when the Mass came. We ended up, after college, we ended up getting married and in my wife's backyard, and there was no mention of God, and we had some Shakespeare sonnets read instead of scriptural quotes. And so then I studied art history for a couple of years in Columbia, and what I really wanted to do was to do art, but I couldn't find any place where I could study art in with the Christian worldview. In other words, in the classical style. So at Washington University,
Because they've all totally sold out?
Sure.
Where you were at that?
Oh, well, there's just a different ideology of, I think ideology is the right word here. It's, there was very much an anti-tradition and an anti-representational attitude, unless you were a super realist. So it's like you had to be non-realist or go totally the other way. So I had a professor there who was a super realist who would do body casts. So anyway, but that ends up dehumanizing too, because you get just simply, it looks like a corpse when you take a body cast.
It's like the time that came during literature during that period. You write a story, but there can't be a plot.
Yeah, was
there
that
can't
was
be
kind
purpose.
of the...
There can't be a goal to this story. It's just...
Yeah, or in music, no
streaming
tonality.
mental thought. It's just going.
Yeah. So I was very distraught. I couldn't find a place. There are probably... But anyway, so we ended up... where I was studying art history, they offered a stone sculpture course, elective. So I just kind of took it and fell in love with stone sculpture. And so we ended up... so it's hard. So for a year, I worked on some statues in New York in a studio in Soho. But to do it right, you have to know the craft. And so everybody told me, you have to go to Italy, a town called Pietrasanta. It's a sculptor's town next to Carrara, a little bit north of Pisa. And so we moved there, and we lived there for 3 years. And I did a statue of my wife, a nude statue, life-size, and a bronze then of her when she was pregnant and with our son. And so during all this time, we're always visiting churches, but again, leaving when the Mass starts. And I remember...
You're just looking at the statues. That
right, but we're coming
up.
closer. And so, because I remember one time...
that cracks me up because I think about the Protestants coming to the church, the one thing they don't look at is the statues.
Yeah.
You're only looking at the statues.
That's good. So I remember one time we were I was in the Sistine Chapel. This is about a month before our conversion. And looking at the Last Judgement there. And tons of tourists, everybody taking pictures. And it just hit me. Here I am admiring this and thinking how beautiful it is, and not asking, is there a judgment? And where will I stand? And what would Michelangelo think about that? He painted this precisely so that we would think about the truth of what he was depicting. And here I've divorced it from the truth question, right? Because, again, going back to the idea that beauty and truth have to go together, how can I be admiring this for its beauty and not willing to admit...
Interesting.
But I didn't. And I had a friend at this time who was, my next door neighbor, was a fallen away Catholic. But he was defending, so even though he fell away, he was still defending Catholicism, and I was defending Buddhism at that time. Anyway, at this time my wife was pregnant, and that's a whole nother story. I remember thinking, I don't have anything to pass on to my son, to our child. A worldview, a conviction about, going back to that professor, he said, I'm a professor is supposed to profess. If I don't profess a conviction, I've failed as a professor. So I'm thinking this now as a father.
Yeah.
I have to, anyway, it bothered me, but I didn't have an answer.
Had you, in that mindset at that time, thinking about what you're going to pass on to your child, had you confronted the idea of what's the foundation for whatever morality you're going to teach your child or anything?
Yeah, no, sure, be good, but what's that, right? So I just avoided those questions of the foundation.
Yeah.
There's a whole interesting story about how we decided to have a child. So we had been living 7 years after marriage, contracepting, and my mom came to visit us, and we were in Siena, and you can stay in St. Catherine of Siena's, at least at that time, as a, kind of in her house. So we were there, and we had this discussion with we should try to conceive it. So I think, St. Catherine was interceding for us. So towards about 6 months through the pregnancy, my wife got this terrible anxiety. And it was irrational and about the health of the child. And one day when she was posing for me, because she was my model, she said she didn't want to live. And she doesn't even remember saying that, but boy, do I. Yeah. And it hit me, oh my goodness, because I had just naively assumed we could fulfill one another, just as we could project values. We could project whether they're moral values or artistic values. And it hit me, I wasn't able to fulfill her. I wasn't able to love her. She needed to be loved. And not only that, I wanted to run away from the problem. And so it just hit me, oh my goodness, I could see her as this heart needing to be loved infinitely. And if it hit me, if there isn't God the Father who loves her that way, life doesn't make sense. And woman number 4 would be true. All of those things that I had originally been indoctrinated in about modern art, that would be true, and that can't be. And so it hit me, I have to also pray to him and ask him to teach me to love her. So I'd never prayed in my life. So I think that's kind of unusual. I was 29, and I hadn't even, played for a grade or a bicycle or anything. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to go to Florence, beauty, and pray in the Duomo. So I got on a train. It was about an hour trip from our house. So I got on the train by myself, and halfway there, I felt moved to pray for the first time in my life. And it was, again, something I hadn't planned out. It was, teach me to love. And then the second thing, and to be a light unto others. Where did that come from? So,
you know what? I don't want to interrupt this flow, because I'm trying to. You have in a sculpture, the external. And you also were committed to the mind. It was almost like you were discovering the heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't mean emotions.
No, that's right.
There's something,
exactly. No, the heart.
There's a deeper thing
that's right.
here that you couldn't fill.
That's right.
In her life.
That's it, exactly.
It was just
exactly
the heart.
The heart. That's right.
The soul.
Yeah, the reasons of the heart. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. So then in the second, after making that prayer, I felt different. It happened to be April in Italy, and it was looking out the window. You've got the buds coming into it. So so it felt like a rebirth. But then so I knew the Bible from art history. In art history, we basically, especially if you study Renaissance art, you have to know the New Testament, because all the subjects, baptism of Christ and so forth. So I knew the verses, even though I'd never prayed them. So what came into my heart right at that moment was a combination of Psalm number 2, you are my son, this day I've begotten you, and the baptism of Christ, you are my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. That came in. But what hit me was, all this time I wasn't thinking about Jesus. I was thinking about God the Father. But what came into my mind there is that those words, you are my son, were actually being said to Jesus by the Father and to us in him. So theologians call that divine filiation. But and so I knew that we had to be Christian. It was.
Yeah, we call that an infusion all of a sudden of an idea in your own heart.
Right. And then I felt again that.
Could you explain that to your wife, or was that?
Yeah. So I ended up going to the Duomo, and it was really hard to kneel down and praying. But the key thing had already happened. It was what happened in the train. So then I go home and I talk to my wife, and she very much wanted to believe because she, again, part of her anxiety was this sense of that we're alone in the universe, that there, that death is the end, and we're ultimately, have this infinite responsibility and all the things that go with kind of atheist existentialism. Nobody wants to stay in that place, or at least I shouldn't say nobody. But so she wanted to believe, but she didn't want to believe irresponsibly. Oh. And so we had this tug of war for a time. And so the next week we decided to go to our local church, and we would pray together before Mass and then leave at Mass. But just as we're about, and so it was a beautiful, again, beauty. The town we lived in had a 9th century church, a Romanesque church, kind of, one of these living churches that get in constant use for 12 centuries, 11th century. And so we went there, and then as we were leaving, when Mass was starting, our landlady came in. Feingold, what are you doing here? Come in. And so we thought, anyway, so we ended up going in and stayed for Mass. That was our first Mass. And both of us were impacted by it, and again, in ways that we hadn't. So it was the 4th Sunday of Easter, which is Vocation Sunday, and Good Shepherd Sunday. And so it was a really simple service and Mass on vocation. The Christian vocation, the married vocation, and the priestly vocation. And I was really moved by it. And then during the communion, I had an experience. There was an old woman sitting next to me, must have been in her late 80s. And when she went down to receive communion, I somehow felt in communion with her and her faith. I later found out she had been to Lourdes and had been cured. She had been a hunchback and had received a miraculous. But anyway, that wasn't what moved me was her faith. So that was the beginning, and my wife had a similar experience. So we kind of, the tug and war went for a while, but there was totally, so we knew we had to be Christian, but we had no idea about Catholic and Protestant. So that was a whole nother battle that we had to go through. And
why don't we pause there?
Okay.
It's a good time for a break. I was thinking because like I said, it doesn't sound like what was drawing you to the church was intellectual apologetics.
No, nothing.
None of that, nothing
I didn't
like
know any
that.
of that.
It was really being drawn by the heart,
right?
In terms of that there's something inside of this statue here, this person. There's something deeper here that you're starting to realize. And part of it is just seeing the faith of this woman. There's something connecting here that's drawing both of your wife there. But yet you don't have any, it doesn't sound like you have labels to put on it yet.
No, not at all.
Nothing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So later I come, Pascal, reasons of the heart. The heart has reasons.
Okay, let's come back to that in a moment. Our guest is Dr. Lawrence Feingold, and I hope that his story is tweaking you if you're watching this program and yourself are maybe coming from a position where you really have no faith background at all. But you're listening to the story and it's tweaking your idea that there's something deeper here, that maybe I'm created for a purpose. And if you're in that journey, I hope you connect with the Coming Home Network, because we're a whole fellowship of folk on the journey. Those of us that have come toward the church and those of us that are seeking to live our faithful Christian lives. If you'd like to connect with us, please do it, chnetwork.org. Be back in a moment. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Dr. Lawrence Feingold. I interrupted you in your journey. You were really, you and your wife were being drawn forward.
Yeah, so it's beauty and it's love, right? So it's those two things. And let me say something about love as a motive of credibility. So, I mean, again, when we were going through this, I wasn't looking at it intellectually, but I had a lot of time to think about it afterwards. And so afterwards, I discovered the line of Pascal, where he talks about reasons of the heart. The heart has reasons that reason doesn't comprehend. So they are reasons, the heart, love actually, very often we say love is blind, right? But in reality, love opens our eyes, because love can see something about the person. When you love somebody, you can't, in the abstract, all right, as an atheist and an atheist as extensions, I can say life is meaningless and death is the end. But when you love somebody, you can't say that, right? I'm not. If I love my wife, I'm not. Yeah. And likewise, that there not be somebody to love her perfectly, and that the heart has that intuition that is smarter than our Cartesian reason. In other words, so I don't want to say it's something irrational at all. No, it's totally rational. It's just that the heart, because it loves, can see the whole person.
Yeah, and you're talking about something that an atheist maybe can't face up to or can't recognize, because what you're talking about is not a physical organ inside the body. You're talking about something that is very much there. And we see it happening all around us. Though from a reason standpoint, it's not an empirically proved reality other than the experiences of people.
Yeah, so beauty and marriage. So marriage is... so for me, the path was beauty and marriage. And it's interesting, I'm thinking about my dad. My dad just passed away a few days ago. And so I've been thinking about his life. And so he was much more open to faith at the end. And it was, again, his wife. His wife passed away 5 years ago. And so the day that we had the funeral, he said, I so envy you believers. I so much want to see her again. And that's what spouses represent, God and God's love to one another. Anyway, so that was the reasons of the heart. At this moment, though, we come to believe in God, and Christ is at the center because we're sons and daughters in Him. But what's the church? So that was the next question that we had to wrestle with. And so this happened in April, and for a whole summer, I was wrestling, going back and forth. So we're living in Italy, but I went to the Anglican priest in Florence. So there's one Anglican church. Actually, there were two at that time. And so he gave me a stack of books, and I was so excited, the family, coming out of atheism. And the first book that he gave me to read was Abandonment to Divine Providence, a Catholic book by Father de Caussade, an 18th century Jesuit, French Jesuit. And that actually totally changed my life, the way I looked at things, because it was the idea that God has providence, right? If you believe in God, He has a providence that governs the ordinary and not just the extraordinary. And therefore, all the things that happen in our day, like right now, are ordered by His providence, and we can see them as a kind of sacramental, the sacrament of the present moment. Anyway, so that changed the way I looked at the world. But at the same, so I was attracted by Catholic vision, but at the same time, growing up in the United States as an atheist, there's a really strong anti-Catholic bias that I had breathed in somehow without knowing it. And so I had all the old, typical questions that a Protestant might have.
Yeah, sometimes I think of, and I obviously can't speak of this from experience, but often I imagine that from a Jewish background, given the Holocaust and all of that the idea of God's providence and control can actually be
a
put off. Did that come to your mind at all? I mean, where's God in this? I think it often led many Jews.
Well, see, that was the key to our conversion, because that's what this anxiety that my wife had was, again, about, it wasn't the Holocaust, it was much more personal, but, and what we saw was that it's precisely I wouldn't have been able to say at the moment, but an encounter with the cross is actually the way to conversion. That's the universal principle, because that forces you to pose the questions. And again, we can pose them abstractly or personally. And then in posing them personally, you've got to...
If you look at the Holocaust, for example, where's a God in this? But the fact that you think it's wrong, that's proof there's a God. The fact that you can look at that and say there's something heinously here, that's a proof that there's a good and a bad, that we can see that at the core of our being.
Outraged if we didn't see the human dignity that's made in the image and likeness of God. But anyway, so we didn't pose all those questions, but the question that we were posing at this moment was Catholic or Protestant. And so what was interesting was I would go back and forth, week one way, week the other way, and I noticed when I thought that we should be Catholic, there was a joy there. And there was a certain sadness when I thought that we couldn't. And the reason for that, I think in my case, was because the path of beauty had led us, in this sense, through an experience of Christian culture, Catholic culture in Italy for, all right, maybe it's not living in the same way today, but at least for 17th century, a long time. And that idea that God was with the whole of that. And when I thought we had to be Protestant, in a way it seemed that God wouldn't have been working in that. And there would be something tragic about it. In other words, I had somehow fallen in love with Catholicity through the Christian culture in art. And I couldn't put my finger on it. But anyway, so I was having that discernment. Later I found out about Ignatian discernment, and that's discernment of spirits. Also, that peace and that joy is a sign. We ended up getting baptized in the Anglican Church in Florence with our baby, who was then 3 months.
A Via Media, halfway between.
That's right, yep.
Kind of Catholic, but not all the way.
Right. But I was thinking at this time of, I wanted to give up, I felt called to give up the art and study theology and give myself totally to transmitting the faith. And so I knew that Anglicans had married priests and Catholics, and so that was part of it. But the Reformation just bothered me. And so I just kind of put it under the rug and didn't think about it. But a couple months later, we were about to leave Italy. I was browsing in the British Library in Florence, and this book just kind of said, take me, a Newman Reader. So I pulled it off the shelf, and I fell in love with John Henry Newman. And I just felt like he was speaking to me, because, again, so many of his concerns, so he talked about the dogmatic principle. That is that, as opposed to a kind of liberal, so I had come out, the idea that we're creating meaning. That was, what I'd been indoctrinated. And then what I found is we receive it. And so that's what he calls the dogmatic principle, that faith comes from above. It's not our building it up from below. And that anyway, it spoke to me. And so I got his autobiography, Apologia Pro Vitami. I started to read through it, and his essay on development of Christian doctrine. And so at this time, my wife was visiting her parents, so we were separated for the moment. And so I called her on the telephone. I told her, Marcia, I think we should become Catholic. And there's kind of this pause, silence for a few moments. But then it was like in the book of Ruth, you trust your. So we started the RCA, and it was December 8th.
I was going to say in a phone call, it's kind of hard to summarize the Apologia Pro Vitasui and the essay on development doctrine. Because there's an awful lot there, even to try and explain to the audience what it was about those that really grabbed you.
Right.
But
again, it was his buying into the whole, right? So he set out in one summer vacation to read the Fathers. All right, that's ridiculous. You can't do that even in a long summer vacation. But it was that love that he had as an Anglican for the whole tradition. And so that's what really spoke to me, and that's what ended up leading him to.
I think a conversion happens in a scientist when he goes from thinking on the one hand, look what I created, to when he realized, no, look what I discovered had always been there.
That's right, yep.
That's a conversion.
Right, exactly. So that's what I was seeing there in what he called the dogmatic principle. That dogma, dogma has a bad name, reputation, right? But it's glorious, right? It means it's something, God's revealed this as saving truth. Yeah.
So your wife came in obediently.
Yeah, so we did the RCA together.
Okay.
Right, that's right. And and so after that, so that's kind of, so we ended up entering the RCA just a couple months after we were baptized, and it was December 8th. I didn't know too much about it. So Mary has a place in this story. I skipped this. So Mary and the Eucharist are kind of steps along the way. While I was still discerning Catholic and Protestant, May came around, and it was the next month after the beginning of conversion, and it was 1988. It was a Marian year. And so our little parish celebrated the Marian year by having they had an image that had been attributed, saving the village from a drought or something, of Our Lady. And so there was a procession with the Archbishop of Pisa and all the people praying the rosary. And again, this was all totally foreign to us, but there was something very attractive about. And so it was a novena of 8 homilies on Mary as the new Eve. So this is given by the Archbishop of Pisa in our local church. And so we went to those every night.
So this was long
before we were baptized.
Yeah, okay.
So about 3 or 4 months before we were baptized. And yeah, so that really spoke to me. But again, can I trust this? But it was, so that was one thing. And then an experience about the Eucharist. Again, before baptism, I went to St. Peter's, and I was walking down the main nave, and to my right, I saw angels by Bernini that I had always wanted to see, but I hadn't located them. And there they were actually the adoring angels in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel. All right. So I didn't know anything about what chapel that was. So I go in to see the angels, and then I look around and see everybody's on their knees, and the monstrance is exposed, which I didn't know what it was. Yeah. But it hit me, like physically. And I ended up going in and being moved to tears, even though I didn't know from a theological point of view. So that was, but again, we still ended up getting baptized.
You had said earlier that one of the reasons you had known so much about the New Testament was because you saw it in art. And I was going to ask that very question. If you're studying art in Europe, you can't escape Mary all over the place. And the Eucharist, even in art. Yeah. Especially in physical art. The beautiful monstrances. You see them in museums where there they are, artwork, and the people have no clue what this is about, but really this points to our Lord.
Right, so again, the reasons of the heart would be all 3 of these. The reasons of the heart are that the human being is made for love, right? To be loved totally and to return that love, right? And so, again, believing in the Father who loves and that he would send his Son out. Those 2 go together. That's why, again, Judaism and Christianity are just, it's an extension of the logic of the divine. So this is, again, I couldn't have put it like that then. But today the fancy term would be the divine condescension, which just means the divine lowering to love us on our level.
I know that after you come into the church, you've been very connected to Hebrew Catholics. And has this journey helped you reappreciate your own background?
You. Yeah, so you can see from what I've said, I was totally estranged from my own background, right? Totally, completely. I would go to Passover Seders with family, but they were non-religious. And so, I knew that our family was Jewish, but no. So it was only afterwards. So after we became Catholic, about 6 months later, I discovered there was this association of Hebrew Catholics. And so I got a newsletter somehow, I don't know how. And so the president, David Moss, and so I called him up out of the blue. And so I didn't end up meeting him for another 15 years. But what happened was I felt a strong attraction to all things Jewish that I'd never had before through Christ, which makes sense. So I wanted to, so I studied Hebrew, and we ended up living for a year in Israel later. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So after we became Catholic, I wanted to study theology. And so we ended up, since we knew Italian from living in Italy doing sculpture, we ended up going to Rome. And so I stayed in Rome for 8 years at the University of the Holy Cross. That's the Opus Dei school there. And I did 1 year in Jerusalem to learn Hebrew. And so we ended up living a 10-minute walk from the Holy Sepulchre, which was our parish. And so every morning it was early, at 5:30 in the morning, is Mass on the empty tomb, or on Fridays on Calvary. But yes, you're walking in the footsteps of Christ, but also rediscovering that Jewish heritage. So I think it's so tragic that it's so often understood as an either or, right? Whereas for us, becoming Catholic opened up the way to the Old Testament.
Pope Benedict particularly emphasizes a hermeneutic of continuity.
Yeah.
And maybe talk a little bit about that, the hermeneutic of continuity between the Jewish and our Catholicism. Almost everything in our Catholic faith has Jewish roots.
Sure, because it's one plan, right? It's one God. I mean, God is the ultimate artist, and so you can't do the perfect thing without perfectly preparing. The perfect thing is that God becomes man so as to love us with a human heart and shed all that blood for us. He's got to prepare it. And so he prepares it in a properly human way by calling a people in which he's going to become man and forming that people with all of their particularity, right, in their language, so that he can become man in them, in a family. Yeah. And so that's...
Yeah, I think about those that want to describe what they find in nature from a totally naturalistic perspective. They're looking for the flow of things, but they're blind to the continuities they see is because of a common creator.
Right. And so continuity you see on every level, right? And so again, it's the beauty written to the cosmos calling us, but above all, the beauty written into the human heart. Right? That's the principal thing. And then the beauty of salvation history is this plan of continuity, right? And so, you can't interrupt or block. I mean, that was kind of the first heresy, Gnosticism, separating the two.
Yeah.
And then the same thing within Christianity. It was the same thing speaking to me in each of those places. Right? So again, Catholic and Protestant the key thing was the principle of continuity, the hermeneutics of continuity. And that's what I fell in love with in Newman. Right? So it's the same principle, I think, governing Judaism, Christianity, and the Catholic.
Our guest is Dr. Lawrence Feingold. How important is it to helping a child's grow in their faith, to helping them understand beauty?
Oh, so important. So important because there are different let me just preface this. There are different temperaments, right? And so some temperaments are going to be more touched by, but nevertheless, I think for everyone, a formation in beauty is crucial. Because beauty's...
we live in a culture that says beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Right. Yeah, but we know it's not true, right? Because, there's a truth to it. The truth to it is that the eye needs to be formed. Right? So if beauty is that which pleases the eye, that's kind of the St. Thomas definition, we should better say beauty is that which pleases the well-formed mind's eye. And therefore, that's going to be something objective, that which is truly beautiful to please the well-formed eye. But I have to form that eye. And that's where I think a formation in beauty is a really important part, ought to be a really important part of education. And it's an apologetics of its own, right? But it's an apologetics that doesn't corner you with a syllogism or a reasoning, but that points.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's like philosophy is so important to getting good theology, but then one wonders, okay, where do I start in philosophy? Because there's good and there's bad out there, and how do I know what's good or bad? Because we live in a soup of ideas. In fact, we live in a soup today where almost nobody knows philosophy, for example. And I think the same thing with beauty. We're just so bombarded with so many contradictory ideas of beauty. How do we begin to be able to form the conscience of our eye, if you will, when it comes to beauty?
So I think the idea of the classics, I mean, for me, that was really important. That our artistic conversion that happened first taught me that I have to, even if, say, my eye has been formed in contemporary art, say abstract expressionism, if I give the Rembrandt, the Michelangelo, the Raphael a chance, right? There's a whole world there, and so going to the classics is, I think, crucial for education. So that's what I learned in art, and then I applied that then in theology, the same principle, right? So there too, one should go to Augustine, to Aquinas, that the classics have a way of forming.
Kind of like the great books idea.
That's right.
Would be the same thing with art. Kind of a great tradition.
And that's the way this professor that I started the program speaking about did. He gave it basically, it was an introduction to art history, and he didn't speak about that many images, maybe, I don't know, 50 during the whole semester. But those 50 are classics, and you want to,
And it seemed like there ought to be a good book that follows it through. I don't know if you have one to recommend to our audience, in terms of that whole formation of the conscience of the I.
Yeah.
Is kind of what we're talking about. How to
Right. But the key thing is looking at what's the bigger picture behind it, right? In other words, the vision of faith or its rejection that's lying behind a particular work of art.
Yeah. Or trying to avoid any idea at all. I mean, that's what you kind of said in many of this modern art, the idea that there's an idea behind it. No, we don't want to stay away from that. I mean, the deadness of that, the emptiness that would kind of leave. We have an email. Jonathan from Missouri writes, Catholics often are misunderstood for their emphasis on the role of sacred tradition in our faith. I've heard, however, that the Jewish faith also recognizes the importance of tradition and even have extra scriptural writings that they refer to. Could Dr. Feingold elaborate a little more on the role of tradition from within a Jewish context?
Right. Well, I mean, everybody knows tradition is gigantic.
You even know the song.
right.
Fiddler on the Roof.
Right. So for an Orthodox Jew, there's a dual Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah. And you can't have one without the other, because how do you know what's the right interpretation of the written Torah without the oral Torah? And that oral Torah is simply the idea of an oral tradition passed orally from Moses through the sages, obviously the prophets and sages, to the rabbinic tradition to today. And that's what makes it, without that oral Torah, there's no Judaism. I mean, there's no...
Right.
And that's what enabled it to live in such adverse conditions of, 19th century diaspora and persecution and so forth. And so that oral tradition it's growing, it's alive, it's a living tradition, right? It incorporates things like the Hasidic movement and culture. And so what was really beautiful for me was seeing how that matches. Now, I didn't know about the oral Torah growing up because I was estranged from that, but it was only finding it out contemporary with exploring the notion of tradition in the Catholic context, right? So they very much...
It sounds like the reason you'll end up with people who are cultural Jews is because they've rejected that oral Torah.
Right. And so part of it, again, what was interesting for me was seeing it's a threefold correspondence here. So the Jewish tradition, the idea of Catholic tradition, but also in art, right? In culture, tradition is crucial. Part of the huge problems, I think, in 20th century art or in contemporary art is, we don't have a sense of a continuity, right? That hermeneutics of continuity. And that culture lives on that. It can't, because that's part of our limitation of human person, that we don't stand alone, right? We're social beings and we have to receive. We receive from above, but we also receive horizontally through history.
We didn't talk about this at all before. Of course, we didn't talk much at all before, but in your study of art and this continuity and the meaning of, did you get into, we're looking from a Western standpoint, did you get into the Eastern iconography at all in your studies? That the way that art is expressed in the Eastern mind?
Eastern Orthodox? Or the far, yeah. Oh, yeah, so there it's much stronger. So they have so they look at the Catholic tradition as having lost. Now, I don't think it's true, but sure, in the the icon tradition, such a beautiful sense that the making. Just even the fact that they had to suffer so much, especially in the East, for icons, and how it goes to. Again, the icon being. God wanted to become visible in the incarnation, and so if he wanted to become visible, he wanted to be represented. But we can't just represent him anyhow, right? He has to be represented in a tradition, in a tradition that keeps a reverence by
those of us
continuity.
from the Western standpoint, we look at an Eastern icon and we don't get it. Because there's so much more to there than merely a realistic painting of the father and the prodigal son. In an Eastern iconography, there's a totally different perspective. And I'm not very familiar with it. I was thinking, as you've been describing it, that it seems like a discovery of iconography for yourself would express a bit of that heart that you were looking for.
Right, yeah. Just that, yeah, so I think that's such a beautiful tradition, right? The tradition of the icon. And what's really, it's Christological, ultimately. That's behind it. But a beautiful thing about the Catholic tradition is that there's room for complementarity. And so that's maybe where I might differ from an Eastern Orthodox who would say you have to do it this way, right? And that the Western kind of development more naturalistically was a decadence or a deviation. I would want to say that, I mean, the beauty of Catholicity is that there's room for a complementarity of every culture. I mean, that's the...
Right.
Christ is bigger than any cultural expression can represent.
Talk about artwork and sculpture. I know I discovered that myself. That when I came into the church, an image like the Infant of Prague was very difficult for me to appreciate as a lifelong American. But once I realized that the Catholic Church involves all these cultures coming together and bringing with them their great treasures, then we see it through their eyes. You know, these great treasures of the artwork that were so deeply meaningful in their perspective they brought together.
Yeah, the prophets. So Prophet Isaiah in the later chapters speaks about the wealth of the nations, right, coming to Jerusalem, and that the nations, the Arabian, and giving gifts. And so one way to interpret that is that that's the cultures of the world giving their own expressions to Christ. Right?
All focused on Christ, not on ourselves. We just got a couple minutes left. Your newest book, The Eucharist, Mystery of Presence, Sacrifice, and Communion. Talk a bit about what the reason for that book and related to your own conversion, discovery of the Eucharist. Yeah,
so I teach in a seminary, and so teaching a class year after year, so I have all these course notes, and so I'm trying to make them into books. But what the book is, the goal in the book is that the study of theology ought not to be a merely academic thing. Right? So the study of theology, and therefore the writing of a book on theology, ought to be something that moves to prayer. And if it doesn't do that, I've failed. And if it doesn't deepen the spiritual life, all right, what better subject than the Eucharist to do that? And so the idea of the book is that the Eucharist, I mean, we've been talking about beauty. The Eucharist is that is the greatest beauty on earth because it's Jesus Christ. But it's a hidden beauty, right? So the Eucharist is the beauty, the fairest of the sons of men, but he's veiled himself in a hidden way, right? And so the Eucharist is a mystery of a beauty of presence, but veiled. Yeah. A greater beauty of sacrifice, right? So we were talking before, the most beautiful thing is the human heart, right? And therefore the most beautiful thing is the human heart in love that gives itself to the end, right? And so the Eucharist is, yes, a mystery of presence, real presence, but even more importantly, it's the mystery of Christ's sacrifice, which is the most beautiful thing on earth. And he sacrificed himself for us, giving himself to his Father, and then giving himself to us. And that would be, so that's the reason for the title, the mystery of presence, sacrifice, and then communion.
I always think of that. Whenever I think of the mystery of the Eucharist, especially if you're kneeling before, a Blessed Sacrament, and there's just so much there, but our senses are not connecting. And I think of that simple prayer in Scripture where the man says, "I believe, but help my unbelief." I mean, what you're asking for is a deeper appreciation for this beautiful Christ before me, that my senses just stop me dead right here. Right.
So it's the hidden beauty. And so we do have a mission, though, to make a visible beauty. That would be the mission of Christian sacred art, right? To represent something, but of course it's going to fail, right? It can't do justice to the hidden beauty. So even though you can only stammer, it's still better sometimes to stammer than to...
That's right, and hope that our lives have beauty in our lives as a result of Christ in our life, so that we are an image for others to draw them closer to our Lord. Dr. Feingold, thank you very much
for
joining us on the program.
It's been a great
pleasure. Our prayers are with you as you continue to teach at the seminary. What an excellent opportunity to do that, to convey your ideas. I also pray that your book helps draw people to see the beauty in the Eucharist and in their own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us on the episode of The Journey Home. Once again, I just want to remind you that if you like this conversion story, there's a bazillion other conversion stories like Dr. Feingold's, both at EWTN on their website, but also at Coming Home Network's website, chnetwork.org. And if there's a way we can help you on your journey, that's what we're here for. Please connect with us. God bless you. See you again next week.